At the height of World War II, the ocean was not a battlefield of heroes, it was a graveyard of ships. The Atlantic churned with wreckage as German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, tearing through Allied convoys with terrifying precision. Freighters carrying food, oil, and ammunition sank faster than they could be replaced. Britain teetered on the edge of starvation, and even the mighty American industry seemed too slow to save her. Victory, it seemed, was being lost not on the front lines, but in the shipyards. Then came one man who refused to accept the impossible. He wasn't a general or an admiral or even a shipbuilder. He was a civilian, a builder of dams, bridges, and dreams. Henry J. Kaiser, a man with no naval experience, no shipyard of his own, and no time to waste. While others saw the crisis as hopeless, Kaiser saw a problem of production, not courage. He believed that ships could be built the way cars were built, not one at a time, but in a constant flow through organization, teamwork, and speed. The world laughed at him. Shipbuilding, they said, was an art, not a factory job. It required skilled craftsmen, not assembly lines. But Kaiser was a man of systems, not traditions. If we can build a dam across the Colorado River, he said, we can build a bridge across the Atlantic. And so began the greatest industrial miracle of the modern age, the creation of the Liberty ship. Ugly, slow, and simple, these steel workhorses would become the beating heart of the Allied war effort. Designed for mass production, they could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the ocean. More importantly, they could be built not in months, but in days. Kaiser's impossible trick was a new way of thinking. Break the ship into hundreds of prefabricated pieces, build them all at once, and weld them together instead of riveting them. It was assembly line warfare, precision by the people, for the people. What followed defied logic and history. Shipyards that had never existed before sprang up overnight. Workers who had never seen the ocean became master welders in weeks. Men and women, black and white, old and young, worked side by side beneath the sparks of progress. And at the height of the war, the impossible became real. A fully operational Liberty ship rolling off the line every 4 days. One, the Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Germans were stunned. Their U-boats couldn't sink ships as fast as Americans could build them. The tide of the Atlantic turned, and with it, the fate of the war. The Second World War was not only fought on land or in the skies above Europe, it was waged across an invisible front that stretched from the frozen waters of the North Atlantic to the burning equator of the Indian Ocean. It was a war of tonnage, a contest of supply lines. Tanks, rifles, food, and fuel were useless unless they could cross the sea, and by 1941, that sea had become a graveyard. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, their periscopes glinting through the gray waves like sharks' fins. Every night, convoys burned on the horizon, flaming silhouettes of freighters, tankers, and troopships sinking into the cold, black deep. Britain, cut off from her colonies and American trade, was starving. In London's war rooms, the math was merciless. Each month, the Allies lost more shipping than their shipyards could replace. If the trend continued, the island nation that stood as Europe's last bastion would collapse from hunger before a single invasion barge left France. To Churchill, the Atlantic was the dominating factor throughout the war. To every sailor who faced it, it was hell. Merchant crews slept in life jackets. The creak of steel at night could mean torpedoes in the dark. By 1941, 1 in every 5 ships bound for Britain never arrived. The lifeline of democracy was fraying, and the enemy needed only patience to sever it completely. Across the ocean, the United States still watched from the sidelines, officially neutral but increasingly uneasy. The arsenal of democracy was awake but unarmed. American yards built merchant ships the old way, by hand, with rivets and sweat, one keel at a time. A single cargo vessel might take 8 months or a year to finish. Even if every ship in every yard worked day and night, the numbers didn't add up. It was simple arithmetic. The Allies were losing ships faster than the world could build them. Admirals demanded more escorts, more convoys, more destroyers. But another voice, quieter and far from the front, began to ask a different question. What if the problem wasn't the sea, but the method? What if the bottleneck wasn't courage, but construction? In an age defined by mass production, cars rolling off assembly lines by the thousands, why were ships still built like cathedrals, one beam at a time? In the autumn of 1940, British representatives arrived in Washington with blueprints for a simple freighter, the Ocean class. It was not fast or graceful, but it could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the Atlantic. The British were desperate. They needed help building them in American yards. Shipwrights examined the plans and nodded grimly. It was doable, but not quickly. Then one civilian, standing at the back of the meeting, raised a hand and smiled. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a naval architect, nor a man of the sea. He was a builder of dams, the Hoover, the Grand Coulee, monuments of concrete and willpower. Where others saw impossibility, he saw engineering problems waiting for an efficient solution. He said later, "You don't build a dam one stone at a time, you pour it all at once." And so, while admirals talked of tonnage and tactics, Kaiser began to dream of a fleet that could be poured, not carved, a fleet built by the calendar, not the clock. As 1941 bled into 1942 and America entered the war, the crisis deepened. Japan struck Pearl Harbor, and now the Pacific burned as well. The United States had to supply 2 oceans, 2 fronts, and countless allies. The call went out for ships, thousands of them, to haul steel, fuel, trucks, ammunition, and food to every corner of the world. The U-boats still prowled. Every cargo vessel lost meant soldiers unfed, aircraft unfueled, and hope delayed. Inside America's ports, shipyards glowed like furnaces. The air rang with hammer blows and the crack of rivet guns. But even working at full capacity, they could not meet demand. The old ways, wooden scaffolds, hand-fitted plates, months of labor by master craftsmen, belonged to another century. If the sea was to be won, shipbuilding itself had to change. That was the world's condition when Kaiser stepped forward, an ocean war being lost not by bravery or strategy, but by arithmetic. He looked at the Atlantic not as a sailor, but as an engineer, and saw the truth no admiral wanted to face. Speed would decide the war. The faster a ship could be built, the faster it could replace those swallowed by the deep. And so began one of the most astonishing transformations in human industry, the race to make ships appear as fast as they could disappear. Across America, new yards sprang up on coastlines that had never seen a launchway. Cities of cranes and welders rose overnight. Kaiser's dream began to take form in steel frames and molten sparks. Reporters scoffed that civilians couldn't outbuild the Navy. But on the waterfronts of Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, ordinary citizens, dockhands, farmers, housewives were about to prove them wrong. They didn't know it yet, but the tide of the Atlantic War was about to turn, not with guns or torpedoes, but with an idea. One civilian's impossible trick that would turn slow, fragile shipyards into roaring factories of victory. In a world drowning in destruction, Henry Kaiser was about to teach humanity how to build faster than it could be sunk. When the United States entered the Second World War after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, its factories rumbled awake like slumbering giants. Tanks, Planes and ammunition began pouring from assembly lines across the country. But in the shipyards, time still moved like it had in the 19th century, slow, methodical, and burdened by tradition. Shipwrights were craftsmen, not manufacturers. They built vessels one at a time, bending steel by hand, riveting plates one by one, shaping keels like sculptors. To them, speed meant carelessness, and carelessness at sea meant death. Into this world of precision and pride stepped Henry John Kaiser, a man who didn't know how to build a ship and therefore wasn't afraid to reinvent the way it was done. Kaiser wasn't a naval engineer. He wasn't even trained in heavy industry. He was a construction man, a builder of roads, dams, and bridges. He had helped carve the Hoover Dam from the desert, had commanded teams of tens of thousands, and had delivered impossible projects ahead of schedule. But when he looked at America's shipyards, he didn't see craftsmanship, he saw bottlenecks. To Kaiser, the old methods were relics of an age when time was cheap. He believed that the sea could be outsmarted not through seamanship, but through systems. Where others saw the shipyard as a workshop, he saw it as an assembly line. You can't fight a 20th century war with 19th century methods, he told a skeptical Navy board in early 1942. We don't need shipwrights, we need production men. He wasn't wrong. By then, German submarines were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Every week, the Atlantic consumed more than 500,000 tons of cargo. Britain was starving, its oil reserves dwindling, its factories desperate for supplies. Each sunken freighter meant fewer tanks in Egypt, fewer planes in Britain, fewer weapons on the front lines. The Allied High Command knew that unless someone found a way to build ships faster than the Germans could destroy them, victory itself might sink beneath the waves. The Navy and the Maritime Commission had plans for new shipyards, but progress was glacial. Bureaucracy moved slower than war. That's when Kaiser made his proposal, an audacious promise to build not just ships, but an entire fleet of shipyards. He would apply to ships the same philosophy that had tamed the Colorado River: break the job into parts, perfect each one, and make them flow like water. Kaiser's genius wasn't in invention, it was in organization. He saw the power of prefabrication before anyone else did. Instead of building an entire ship in one place, he divided the process into sections that could be built simultaneously and then welded together. It was manufacturing, not shipbuilding, a revolution in steel. He said the shipyard should be a funnel, with materials pouring in at one end and ships pouring out the other. The experts laughed. Admirals scoffed at the idea of welding ships instead of riveting them, arguing that welds would crack under stress. Labor leaders doubted that trained civilians could handle precision steelwork. Traditional shipbuilders called him reckless, a dreamer. But Kaiser thrived on disbelief. "If they're not laughing," he once said, "you're not dreaming big enough." He began his experiment in Richmond, California, near the chill waters of San Francisco Bay. The place was nothing but empty land and salt marsh when he arrived. Within months, it was a forest of cranes, gantries, and half-finished hulls. Rail lines snaked into the yard, carrying steel from Pittsburgh and Portland. Barracks and dormitories sprang up around the site, followed by cafeterias, clinics, and even daycare centers. The Richmond shipyards became a city in themselves, a living embodiment of what industrial democracy could accomplish when united by purpose. To lead his workforce, he recruited from everywhere: steelworkers from the Midwest, lumbermen from Oregon, farmers from the plains, and women from across California who had never held a torch before. He trained them, paid them fairly, and gave them pride. "You're not just building ships, you're building freedom," he told them. For many women, it was the first job they'd ever held outside the home. They took to welding like artists to canvas, sparks lighting their faces as they fused steel into the shape of salvation. By mid-1942, Kaiser's shipyards were turning out cargo vessels faster than any in history. His first few ships took months. Then, as the process smoothed, the time shrank to weeks. Prefabricated sections were welded together on massive jigs, cranes swinging them into place with clockwork precision. Every worker understood that they were part of something larger, a synchronized human machine. Kaiser had done the unthinkable. He had turned the shipyard into a factory. And the results were staggering. Where traditional yards might launch a few ships per year, Kaiser's yards produced dozens. The Germans couldn't believe it when they saw the numbers. Impossible, one intelligence report read. No nation can build ships so fast. But Kaiser's factories were proving that speed itself was a weapon. Each Liberty ship that slid into the water carried not only supplies, but a message. America's strength was not just its soldiers, but its citizens. Still, Kaiser's ambition didn't stop there. "If we can build one in weeks," he said with a grin, "we can build one in days." His engineers stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Days? Building a ship that size took thousands of hours of welding, assembly, and testing. But Kaiser meant what he said, and he would soon prove it. In the next months, his methods would evolve into something that bordered on magic, a system so efficient, so coordinated, that new ships would seem to appear out of thin air. The world would watch as a civilian, a man who had never gone to sea, taught the navies of the world how to build faster than they could sink. And when the first Liberty ships started pouring off the line, the Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied dreams, would become their highway to victory. The year was 1942, and the world stood on the brink of starvation, not from lack of courage, but from lack of ships. The oceans had become the arteries of survival, and they were bleeding out faster than anyone could have imagined. Convoy after convoy fell prey to German U-boats. Each torpedoed freighter took with it food for civilians, fuel for tanks, and ammunition for soldiers who fought on in desperation. The question haunting Allied command was not how to win battles, but how to keep the sea alive. The solution was already taking shape in the mind of one civilian visionary, Henry J. Kaiser. What he had promised, a fleet of simple, fast-built cargo ships, was taking form in the shipyards of Richmond, California, and on the East Coast at places like Brunswick and Savannah, Georgia. His impossible trip was about to give birth to the most extraordinary ship in maritime history, the Liberty ship. It was not beautiful. In fact, it was almost deliberately ugly. It lacked the sleek lines of cruisers or the menace of destroyers. Its hull was square, its bow blunt, and its deck cluttered with cranes and hatches. But beauty was irrelevant. The Liberty ship was designed with one sacred purpose: to be built fast. Kaiser understood that in war, perfection was the enemy of speed. The Liberty was not a masterpiece, it was a miracle of simplicity. The design itself came from the British, a humble ocean-class freighter that had been created to haul cargo across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. When Britain realized it couldn't build them fast enough, it turned to America. The U.S. Maritime Commission brought the plans to Henry Kaiser and asked for help. Kaiser took one look at the blueprints and smiled. "We'll make it simpler, and we'll make it ours." He handed the designs to his engineers, men trained not in shipyards, but in factories. Together they stripped away everything that slowed production, every curve that required hand-fitting, every rivet that demanded precision. Gone. In their place came straight edges, standardized panels, and prefabricated sections. The Liberty ship was broken down into roughly 250 major components that could be built simultaneously, then welded together like a giant puzzle. This was the revolution. For centuries, ships had been riveted, each hole drilled and sealed by hand. Riveting required teams of skilled craftsmen and took immense time. Welding, by contrast, was faster, cheaper, and more flexible. It could be done by ordinary men and women with minimal training. Traditionalists called it dangerous, claiming welds would crack in cold seas. Kaiser's response was simple: "We'll test it in battle." And so the new ships began to rise. Their skeletons grew not from the keel up, but from every direction at once. Frames, decks, and superstructures assembled in different yards, then brought together like organs of a living body. Cranes hoisted giant steel panels into place with the precision of surgery. Sparks danced like fireflies across the night sky as thousands of welders worked in unison. The sound of hammering rivets, once the heartbeat of shipbuilding, was replaced by the hiss and flash of molten arcs. At first, progress was slow. The workers were new, the systems untested, and the materials inconsistent. The first Liberty ship took more than 6 months to complete, but each launch taught a lesson, each bottleneck revealed a fix. Welding teams reorganized, assembly lines were retimed, blueprints were redrawn to eliminate wasted effort. The second ship took half the time, the third half again. The learning curve steepened until the impossible began to feel routine. The Liberty ship was 441 feet long, 57 feet wide, and capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. It could cross the Atlantic at 11 knots, slow but steady, dependable, and armed with just enough anti-aircraft and deck guns to defend itself. Most important of all, it could be replaced faster than it could be sunk. When Kaiser announced his production goals, a ship every 4 days, even his allies doubted him. The press called it Kaiser's fantasy fleet, but the workers of Richmond and the other Kaiser yards took it as a challenge. The first test came with the launching of the Patrick Henry, named after the American revolutionary who once declared, "Give me liberty or death." It was a fitting name for the first of its kind, a vessel built to carry the freedom of nations across an ocean of war. On September 27, 1941, thousands gathered to watch it slide down the ways. Flags waved, a brass band played, and a bottle of champagne shattered across the bow. The ship creaked, then thundered into the water, the birth cry of a new era in shipbuilding. As the Patrick Henry made her maiden voyage, the German Navy dismissed her as a curiosity. The propaganda machine mocked her square lines and civilian origins. But within months, those ugly ducklings, as they were called, began to multiply. Each launch drew crowds of cheering workers. The docks became stages of victory, each launch a small act of defiance against tyranny. "We build 'em faster than they can sink 'em" became the rallying cry of the shipyards. Kaiser's innovation spread like wildfire. Yards on both coasts adopted his modular welding methods. Plants that had never seen the sea before, in Texas, Louisiana, and Maine, began producing sections for the Liberty ships. Trains hauled massive steel plates across the country, while women with welding torches worked side by side with men on the assembly lines. The shipyards never slept. Floodlights turned night into day, and the noise of construction echoed across the water 24 hours a day. By 1943, the results were staggering. Liberty ships were launching not by the dozen, but by the hundred. In that single year, 2,710 were completed, more than all Axis shipping combined. The Allies finally had their bridge across the ocean. Convoys thickened, supplies flowed, and the once dominant U-boats began to starve. Hitler's admirals could no longer keep pace with the flood of steel that Kaiser's dream unleashed. But the most spectacular moment came in November 1942 when the world witnessed what became known as the miracle of the Robert E. Peary. At the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, workers attempted the unthinkable: to assemble an entire Liberty ship in less than 5 days. The event became a sensation. Reporters, generals, and officials crowded the yard to watch. Crews worked in 3 continuous shifts, thousands of hands moving in perfect synchronization. Sparks flew, Engines roared, and the skeleton of the ship grew by the hour. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the Robert E. Peary slid into the water, complete, functional, and seaworthy. It was not a stunt, it was a statement. The impossible had become ordinary. The ship was a physical declaration of what industrial democracy could achieve. The Germans, reading the reports, were speechless. One intelligence officer wrote simply, "This cannot be." But it was. The birth of the Liberty ship was not just a triumph of steel, but of imagination. It proved that innovation did not belong only to generals or scientists, but to ordinary people who dared to question tradition. Kaiser had taken the old rhythm of shipbuilding, measured in months, and turned it into a drumbeat of days. The war at sea would never be the same again. From that point forward, the Allies were not just fighting to survive, they were building to win. And with every new Liberty ship that took to the water, the tide of the ocean war turned a little further toward freedom. The Liberty ship was born from necessity, but it was perfected through an act of genius, an innovation so bold, so unorthodox, that even the engineers who built it struggled to believe it could work. It wasn't a weapon, a tactic, or a strategy. It was a trick, a reimagining of what it meant to build, to coordinate, and to think. It was Henry Kaiser's impossible trick, to turn chaos into rhythm, steel into movement, and civilians into the fastest shipbuilders the world had ever seen. The secret of the trick was not in the materials or the machines, it was in the method. Kaiser believed that anything that could be divided could be conquered. He saw a ship not as a single structure, but as a series of problems waiting to be solved in parallel. Every traditional shipyard in the world had worked in sequence. The keel laid first, then the hull, then the deck, then the fittings. One stage had to be completed before another began. Kaiser shattered that logic. He imagined the shipyard as a vast mechanical orchestra, each section building its own part of the melody, all converging in perfect harmony at the finale. His first rule: no waiting. Every inch of time lost was a victory for the enemy. Materials had to move like blood, constantly circulating. Steel from Pittsburgh, rivets from Cleveland, engines from Detroit, all had to arrive just in time, never too early to clog storage, never too late to stop the flow. This was logistics elevated to art, and Kaiser was its conductor. He built rail spurs directly into the shipyards so that entire freight trains could unload their cargo into waiting assembly bays without ever stopping the line. The second rule: build in pieces. The Liberty ship was divided into 250 prefabricated sections, each built separately in a different part of the yard. Deckhouses, hull plates, bulkheads, even engine rooms were assembled as independent modules. Welders worked on flat ground, safer, faster, easier to supervise, while cranes loomed above like titans, lifting entire sections into place when they were ready. It was as if the ship was growing all at once, in every direction. Each component was born ready to join the others, fitted to within fractions of an inch. What had once taken months of sequential craftsmanship now took days of simultaneous labor. And then came the most radical rule of all: weld, don't rivet. This single decision changed the course of shipbuilding forever. Riveting had been the pride of shipwrights for generations, strong, dependable, and tested by time. But riveting was slow. Each rivet required a team, one man heating, another hammering, a third holding the steel steady. Welding replaced all that with one man and a torch. Sparks replaced hammers, precision replaced muscle. Critics said welded hulls would crack in cold water, that they weren't strong enough for the open ocean. Kaiser ignored them. A good weld, he said, is as strong as the steel itself. And he was right. Welded ships didn't just build faster, they sailed stronger. The speed of production skyrocketed. At first, it took Kaiser shipyards 230 days to build a Liberty ship. Within months, that number dropped to 140, then 70, then 30. By 1943, they were averaging one every 4 days. To put that in perspective, a ship longer than a football field, weighing over 14,000 pounds, assembled from 1.5 million parts every 4 days. It was an act of defiance against both physics and tradition. The world took notice. Newspapers ran headlines that sounded like miracles. Civilians build ships faster than navies. Photographs showed lines of workers under the floodlights, sparks flying like fireflies, faces smeared with soot and pride. Men who had never seen the ocean and women who had never worked outside the home were now launching the vessels that fed armies across it. One worker joked, "We don't build ships here, we grow them." But behind the jokes was exhaustion and purpose. The yards ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts rotating with military precision. When one whistle blew, another sounded. Meals were eaten on the line, sleep stolen in the corners of break rooms. The cafeteria ran like a barracks mess, feeding thousands of men and women at all hours. The shipyards were cities of motion, their population measured not in people, but in horsepower. Henry Kaiser himself walked the floors often, his hat pulled low, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't park orders, he asked questions, small, precise ones that cut through layers of bureaucracy. Why is this crane idle? Why isn't this section ready? He had the uncanny ability to see the flow of work like a map, spotting the smallest delay and turning it into opportunity. His lieutenants called him the man who sees the invisible. To Kaiser, inefficiency was treason. But he didn't punish mistakes. He studied them, learned from them, and redesigned the system to eliminate them. His crowning demonstration came with the Robert E. Peary experiment, the ship built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a proof of concept, a challenge to every factory, every mind, every limit. Thousands of workers volunteered for the task. They rehearsed every step like soldiers before an assault. Materials deliveries were timed to the minute. Cranes moved like clock hands. At the signal, the construction began, a dance of machinery, sweat, and faith. Reporters called it the miracle ship. The German High Command, when they received the intelligence report, refused to believe it. How could a nation of civilians build something so complex in less time than it took their own shipyards to lay a keel? "It is impossible," one officer wrote. "They must be lying." But the Liberty ship sailed, and the proof was undeniable. In that moment, the myth of Nazi industrial superiority cracked like the hull of a sinking freighter. Kaiser's impossible trick had changed the rules of war. The Allies no longer fought from scarcity, but from abundance. The Liberty ships flowed across the Atlantic like a river of steel. When German submarines sank one, another appeared before the oil slick had spread. The ocean, once a graveyard, became an assembly line. For the first time in the war, the numbers favored freedom. What made it all possible wasn't magic, it was mindset. Kaiser had taken the logic of the factory and married it to the courage of ordinary people. He proved that the battlefield didn't end where the land met the sea. The shipyard was a front line, and its workers were soldiers of production. Each welded plate, each crane movement, each launch ceremony was an act of resistance against tyranny. And perhaps the greatest miracle of all was that it came from civilians, from men and women who had never held a rifle, but whose tools struck blows just as deadly. They didn't fire bullets, they built bridges across oceans. They didn't march, they manufactured. Their impossible trick wasn't just building ships faster, it was believing that ordinary hands could accomplish the extraordinary. By the end of 1943, when Henry Kaiser stood on the balcony overlooking his Richmond yards, the view stretched to the horizon: cranes, hulls, smokestacks, and the silhouettes of 100 ships waiting for launch. He smiled and said quietly to his engineers, "They said it couldn't be done. Well, now it can't be undone." By 1944, the Liberty ships had become the veins and arteries of the Allied war effort, carrying the lifeblood of freedom across oceans ruled by danger. What had started as Henry Kaiser's impossible experiment had now become the pulse of victory itself. From the gray Atlantic to the burning Pacific, these simple, square-shouldered cargo vessels became the unsung heroes of the Second World War. They didn't fight, they delivered, and in a war that devoured supplies faster than any army could advance, delivery was everything. Each Liberty ship was a miracle in motion, 441 feet of steel and spirit, built not for beauty, but for endurance. They carried tanks for Patton's army, fuel for Spitfires, wheat for starving cities, and ammunition for invasions yet to come. They carried the hopes of continents, and they did it under constant threat. Every voyage was a gamble. The sea was a battlefield with no trenches to hide in, and the German U-boats were merciless. But for every ship that sank beneath the waves, two more seemed to appear on the horizon. That was Kaiser's victory, not just in speed, but in inevitability. The convoys that stretched from New York to Liverpool, from San Francisco to Manila, were built on the backbone of Liberty ships. They steamed in tight formation, black smoke curling into the cold sky, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that guarded them like shepherds watching their flock. To the sailors aboard them, these ships were both lifeline and coffin. They slept in hammocks strung above crates of ammunition, ate meals of canned beans and coffee, and listened for the dreadful sound of torpedoes slicing through the water. Many never came home. The Liberty ship crews suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the war, but they kept sailing. In the bitter winter of 1943-44, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its climax. The German U-boats, once unstoppable, began to falter. The Allies had finally cracked their codes and improved sonar technology, but it was the flood of ships, the sheer abundance, that overwhelmed them. The Liberty ships replaced losses faster than the submarines could sink them. The ocean, once dominated by predators, was now ruled by production. An admiral in the Royal Navy said it best: "The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the welders of America." In Britain, the arrival of Liberty ships became a daily miracle. Each one brought life: crates of butter, coffee, and grain, jeeps stacked on decks, barrels of aviation fuel lashed to the rails. Civilians cheered as they docked, their hulls streaked with rust and salt, their decks manned by exhausted but smiling sailors. A single Liberty ship could carry enough food to feed a city for a week, enough fuel to keep an army moving for days. They were the lifeboats of civilization. And when the time came for invasion, Operation Overlord, D-Day, the Liberty ships were there too. They carried the tanks, the ammunition, the landing craft, and the very steel that built the temporary harbors off Normandy's beaches. Without them, the largest amphibious invasion in history would have been impossible. The Liberty ships formed the invisible bridge between continents, the steady, unbroken chain that fed the war machine of freedom. And they didn't just serve in the Atlantic. In the Pacific, where distances stretched beyond imagination, they became the skeleton of a vast logistical empire. They ferried supplies to tiny islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where Marines fought yard by yard. They brought fuel to aircraft carriers, medicine to field hospitals, and food to troops stranded on coral reefs. The tropical heat cracked their decks, and enemy aircraft strafed their convoys, but still they came, unglamorous, dependable, indestructible. The sailors who manned them joked that the Liberty ships were ugly but honest. They groaned and shuddered in heavy seas, their welded plates sometimes creaking like old doors, but they did their job. One captain said, "You couldn't love her, but you could trust her." That trust was earned in steel and sacrifice. Many ships never reached port. They went down in flames, their crews swallowed by the sea. But even in death, their purpose endured, because their loss was always temporary. Every 4 days, another Liberty ship was launched, another ghost replaced by a fresh hull and a new crew. The Germans could not understand it. Their entire strategy depended on strangling Allied supply lines. But Kaiser's industry magic turned that strategy into suicide. For every U-boat that sank a ship, Allied bombers sank 2 U-boats. The math was no longer on Hitler's side. The tide had turned, not in a single battle, but in a million acts of labor back home. As the war pressed toward its end, Liberty ships filled every Allied port in Europe. In Italy, they unloaded crates of oranges and artillery shells side by side. In France, they brought fuel for the tanks rolling toward Paris. And in the Pacific, they carried the bulldozers that built airfields and the bombs that would end the war. They were everywhere, slow, steady, and unstoppable. The Axis called them Kaiser's ghosts, because even when sunk, they seemed to return. But perhaps the greatest victory of the Liberty ship was not military at all. It was moral. It proved that a free society could mobilize without coercion, that civilians could outproduce empires, that democracy could beat dictatorship not just with courage, but with coordination. The Liberty ships were monuments to teamwork, thousands of hands working in unison across thousands of miles. No tyrant ordered them to work. They did it because they believed the world was worth saving. By 1945, when Germany finally fell, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, enough steel to bridge the Atlantic itself. They carried over 75% of all cargo used by the Allies during the war. The statistics were staggering. 29 million tons of cargo delivered, 5 million troops transported, and an uncountable number of lives saved. Without them, victory would have been delayed by years, perhaps lost altogether. When the war ended, the Liberty ships came home, battered, dented, scarred, but triumphant. Some were scrapped, others carried on as merchant vessels. A few were converted into hospitals or floating supply deposits. Their work was done, but their legacy had just begun. Kaiser's ugly ducklings had proven that speed and simplicity could win wars, that mass production could be as decisive as any weapon. In Washington, a naval historian summed it up simply. The Allies did not win by building better ships. They won by building enough. That was the genius of Henry Kaiser. He had taken the art of shipbuilding and turned it into a science of survival. His Liberty ships didn't just carry cargo, they carried the faith that ingenuity could conquer destruction. As the sun set on 1945, one could stand on the docks of Richmond or New York or Liverpool and watch the Liberty ships lying at anchor, hundreds of them, their decks silent now, their flags drooping in the evening wind. The war was over. The world they had saved was beginning again. And in the quiet that followed, the welders, riveters, and shipwrights who had built them looked at their calloused hands and realized something profound. They hadn't just built ships, they had built victory. They had built hope. They had built the future.